It must have occurred to you, too, that this interest in diversification is pretty much the kind of a farm that you grew up on.
Yes, and that has not gone unnoticed. Let me give you a little example about that. Like I say, I did grow up in farm in southern Minnesota, and it's, as I've thought about this and moving in this direction, now the farm I grew up on, we had about 50 milk cows. My father was a purebred Holsteins and was very proud of them. And of course, we didn't get the kind of yields that farmers get now in our corn and so forth. But now we have much better varieties, and we know much more about the biological and physical and economic aspects of doing this and so forth and so on. But let me just indicate in regard to that particular farm. Now we did have diversification, and we had the pasture where the cows were and so forth, and that's kind of where we had some of the meadow area and some of the wetlands and so forth, and that's where some of the wildlife was. And we had, in the back of the farm, we had some of these hills that were rather steep, and in fact, with the advice of SCS and Extension and so forth, we did some contour farming, to make sure we didn't get any more erosion than what we needed. Quite frankly, the tractors that we had couldn't go up and down the hill anyway. It didn't have enough power, so we had to go around the hill, you understand.
Enforced conduit.
Yeah, and so we had forced conservation practices, but we did. And so we had a variety of crops. I mean, we had corn and oats or wheat or flax, whatever the market, and really, in all honesty, you see, there was another reason for that, in that my father had a fair amount of diversification because he had to have that, because he had to cover the risk. The government didn't cover the risk, which is really the case now.
Right.
Because the government says, I'm going to guarantee you a certain price for a given crop, and whereas he didn't have that situation. So he had a fair diversity, and so he'd emphasize whatever he anticipated he would get the most money for. So anyway, we had a fair amount of diversity, and we had a fair amount of wildlife and a fair amount of wetlands and so forth and so on. That same farm today, and my father sold it in the mid-50s, and when he retired, and it's just corn and soybeans. And the fellow that runs that farm comes up, and he's got 4-row. He's got equipment that allows him to go almost, and he can go right through that lowland. He can go right up and down that hill. And it's lost a lot of diversity. It doesn't have near the wildlife that it did before. We used to have pheasants and ducks and all that kind of stuff. And that's not right. We are basically, and we had a meeting out in Omaha. This was last year, year before. So the Soil Conservation Society put it on, and one of the speakers indicated that really what we have between Omaha and Minneapolis, and he just flew down that morning from Minneapolis, and he says basically it's an ecological desert.
Oh.
Now you just think about that. It's really kind of an interesting point. And because we've gotten to the point where we're just growing 2 crops. We have very little diversification. The livestock has gotten to the point. Now that's not true. A fair amount in Minnesota and Wisconsin, you got a lot of dairy and so forth, so you still have some of that. But in Iowa, you primarily got cash crop, primarily. And that's true in a lot of the corn belt and so forth and so. But we've gotten to a point where we have just 1 or 2 crops. You have very little diversity. So you don't, it's not only that it causes problems from the standpoint of soil buildup and creating enough humus in the soil and all this sort of thing, but it has affected the ecology of our Midwest. It really has, with the kind of, and to a large extent, quite frankly, our government programs have been a fair part of that because they have provided the farmer with the option of, quite frankly, he makes more money just growing corn.
Do you see the government support continuing?
Well, I think the support will continue. You're always going to have with the vagaries that the farmer has to deal with, and of climate and uncertainties. But I think, and there has been a real effort, there's going to be a real effort in this particular farm bill to encourage more diversification out there. And to get, quite frankly, away from being so dependent on the government. And the administration is very interested in that. I think a number of the people in Congress are. But it's very difficult to move away from a support program to one where you don't have support. That's just like anyone that's on welfare to go. I mean, really. And that's, I don't in any way want to imply that the farmer is on welfare here, because what it amounts to, he's producing food for the U.S. society, and when we as taxpayers want to, because we want to have a secure food supply, there's no question about that.
But to withdraw financial support after you've been
exactly.
giving it to someone is
and so I think most farmers want to move more to a market-based economy, but they don't want to at the same time go broke, and I don't blame them.
Who does?
And so we're going to have to do this very carefully, but I think there's an interest on the part of a lot of folks to encourage farmers to be more market-based. And if we were, quite frankly, we'd have more diversification. You see, it comes back to the experience I was telling about with my father, where he had to have a fair amount of diversification so that he could cover his own risk. If you have the government saying that I will guarantee X amount for you, now I'm not saying the target price is too high or too low. I mean, it's very, very difficult for him. But that becomes the most risk-free option. You see what I'm getting at? And he can go to the bank then. If he or she can go to the bank and get loans, much easier.
Yes, of course.
You know, it's much...
Bankers understand
that. They know that the government check will come. They're not sure about whether somebody will pay them for a crop. You know, you see what I'm getting at? So it's... but there is. I think this farm bill will have some, will move more towards encouraging diversification. I think the next one will do it even more.
It's an exciting time with lots of changes going on. Do you have any message for people watching us or listening to us in the future?
Well, I think in regards to sustainable agriculture, my prediction is that the kind of agriculture we're talking about in this area will be much more the kind of agriculture we have in the future. I'm convinced of that, because we're going to have an agriculture that is much more environmentally friendly, and one that the consumer is going to insist on their food being as safe, and we're going to have to go overboard. Even though scientifically we may say that what we have now is safe, and I really think it is, to a large extent it is safe, but we're going to have to go overboard and ensure that it's safe. So both from the standpoint of, from a conservation and a production standpoint, I think that we're going to move more towards a balance between being in concert with environmental concerns and the profitability concerns. And the things that we're talking about, Lisa-type farms today, will be conventional farms within 10, 15 years.
10 or 15 years?
Yep.
That's an exciting prospect.
So that's my prediction.
Well, I thank you very much for coming, and I am thrilled to be part of gathering information on the subject.
Right. Thank you very much.